Hi, my name is Jody Grass, and today we're going to study Exodus 1. Now, we're going to start today a little bit different, and I'm going to ask you to, even if you need to hit pause to do this, I want you to think about a difficult situation that you're facing right now, an area where you feel like you are maybe even in suffering. So it might be a difficult relationship that you're trying to navigate. You might be in a time of financial hardship. There might be you're looking for a job and you can't seem to find one, or there's a situation at your job that is difficult. Whatever that situation is, you've got a diagnosis that is hard, or a loved one has a hard diagnosis. Whatever that situation is, I would love for you to just write that down. I'm not going to ask you to share it with anybody. This is for you to hold on to as we go through this lesson. If you don't have something that you're in a difficult time right now, then just think back on a difficult time in your life. We all have those. And just write down a time when you remember that you felt like you were in a season of suffering. And I think that's going to be helpful for us to hold that as we walk through Exodus 1. Now, a couple things we want to remember as we study Exodus. Sarah shared last week that Exodus is a book about God, right? We know that it tells Moses' story and the story of the Israelites, but Exodus points to God, and we need to hold that in front of us every week as we study through this book, because we want to be looking for God sightings. Where do we see God at work? How do we see God revealed in this story in the book of Exodus? Okay, we're going to jump into Exodus 1:1. Now, I want to start by just telling you something that's super interesting, is that the first word, Exodus was written in the Hebrew language originally, and the first word of Exodus is and. Now in English, we don't start sentences typically with and so in the translation, they left that out. But the reason I think that's important is because it tells us that even though Genesis is a separate book, Sarah talked about that, how we separate books, chapters, verses, so we kind of separate the Bible out. But this was one continuous writing that Moses wrote. So he finished writing Genesis, and he said, and because the story continues. There's not an end and a beginning here. This is the continuation of the story of God and pointing God's children to him. So we know in the closing of Genesis 50, verses 24 and 25, then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear on oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph was letting the Israelites know, this is not your home. You will be leaving Egypt and going into the promised land that God promised in the covenant to Abraham and passed it on to Isaac and to Jacob, then to the Israelites, that they would become a great nation and they would live in the promised land. Now keep in mind, 400 years have passed from when Joseph said that to when we start the story of the Israelites in Exodus 1. So we start the story with God's people in Egypt. That's your first fill in the blank. Exodus 1, verses 1 through 5. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, if you studied Genesis with us, that might sound a little familiar because it is kind of a repeat of Genesis 46, verse 8, but it's letting us know what of Jacob's family traveled into Egypt to join Joseph there during the famine. And it says 70 in all. Now, what that means is not 70 people total. That means 70 men traveled to Egypt and settled in the land of Goshen, and plus women and children. So there were more than 70. We just want to be mindful of that. All right, we recognize in this next section that there is fruitfulness in Egypt. God's promise is fulfilled. So after studying Genesis, this next section that we read, there should be some familiar words, and I want you to pay attention to that. Verses 6 and 7. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Do you hear those words that are familiar? Exceedingly fruitful, multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Where have we seen those words before? Well, they are all over Genesis. I'm just going to share a couple of places where we see them. First, we see them in God's command to Adam and Eve. In Genesis 1, verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it." We see it again in Genesis 9, verse 1 as a command to Noah when he got off of the ark. He said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." And then we see it, God establishes a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15. And then in Genesis 17, we hear God reiterate that covenant with him and the promise. And in Genesis 17, verse 2, it says, "Then God is speaking to Abram, I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers." And then verse 6, "I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you." We hear God reiterate that promise to Isaac in Genesis 26, verse 4. "I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and will give them all these lands, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed." And then we see God give that command, reiterate that command to Jacob in Genesis 35, verse 11. "And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants." So the Israelites went from 70 men traveling into Egypt. And then we're going to learn about this in a few weeks. But in Exodus 12:37, it says the number who left Egypt, 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. So the Israelite nation came from one man and his barren wife. It grew to 70 people who went into Egypt to join Joseph and his two sons. And that nation grew to 600,000 men that will eventually leave Egypt. Talk about seeing God's fulfillment of his promise. God promised they would be a great nation, and he fulfilled that promise. Abraham didn't see it. Isaac didn't see it. Even Jacob really didn't see it in its completion. As we move on to the next section, we see how God's people experience suffering in Egypt. Verses 8 through 10 says, "Then a new king, whom Joseph meant nothing to, came to power in Egypt." Now, there's a couple of thoughts on that verse. One is that so many years have passed, around 400 years have passed. And so a new system had come in to rule Egypt. And so this Pharaoh might not have even been from that land and maybe didn't even know who Joseph was, though he would have heard stories of Joseph. It also could mean that a descendant became the Pharaoh or the king, but he too, we're now 400 years removed. So though they've heard stories of Joseph's power and his influence on and saving Egypt, they don't feel like they owe anything to Joseph at this point. And so we just want to pay attention to that. So start at verse 9, it says, "Look, he said to his people," this is Pharaoh talking to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as storehouse cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So this is where the Israelites' suffering begins. They've had it pretty good in Egypt up to this point. They were living in Goshen, which is just kind of outside of Egypt, because they tended flocks, tended sheep and animals. And the Egyptians really looked down on people who tended animals. And so they lived kind of just outside of Egypt, but they were left to themselves. They were able to do what they did. And obviously they were doing quite well in that land because they were growing incredibly and they had grown into this great nation. There was no reason for the Israelites to leave Egypt. They had it good. There's a quote that from my Story of God Bible commentary by Christopher J.H. Wright, and he's quoting John Calvin, and here's what he says. John Calvin suggests that without the oppression of Pharaoh, the Israelites might have preferred to remain forever happy and thriving in the land of Egypt, which would have nullified God's promise to Abraham. So suffering happens for all kinds of reasons. I mean, just for starters, we need to understand that we live in a fallen world. We live post Genesis 3, where sin enters the world. And so suffering is going to happen because we live in a fallen world. John 16:33 says, in this world, Jesus is teaching, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart. I have overcome the world. So we should expect trouble in this world. There will be suffering. But we also need to pay attention to what Jesus says next. But take heart, I, Jesus, have overcome the world. So we want to make sure that when we're in a season of suffering, that we have our eyes not on our problems, but on Jesus. So sometimes suffering is just because we live in a fallen world. Sometimes suffering is used to move us out of our comfort zone. I can name so many times when that suffering was, God used suffering to move me out of where I was. And I had no intention of moving up to that point. I'll tell you one story quickly. When I came on staff at Emmanuel Church, there were a lot of different ways that God worked to move me to say yes to that position. But in that season, my husband and I had a business, a woodworking business. And he was obviously full-time. I worked a few hours for our business every week, and the rest of the time I was really home with the kids. And there was some stuff going on in the world that was making finances tight. And so we got to a point where it would really actually help. We kind of needed me to get a part-time job. And so I hadn't gone out really seeking a part-time job yet. I hadn't really told people I was looking for a job. I just was praying about it and kind of starting to think about where I might be able to go to get a part-time job that would work with the kids during the summer and that kind of a thing. Out of the blue, I got a phone call from somebody from church, and they asked me if I would consider overseeing this new ministry they were implementing for 5th and 6th graders. I can tell you that there's a lot of other pieces, like I told you, but if we were not in a financial position where I needed to work, I probably would have quickly said no to that job opportunity because I enjoyed my rhythm. There was no reason to change it. But the financial pressure that we felt had prepared me to already begin kind of praying about finding a job when this call came out of the blue. And eventually I did say yes to coming on staff. And I've been on staff here for 20 years. I'm so grateful for God providing that opportunity for me to be able to join the staff here at Emmanuel Church. He has grown me incredibly because of my work for the church. But that movement truly did come out of suffering. So sometimes God uses suffering to move us out of our comfort zone. Sometimes we learn the most in a season of suffering. It can cause us to really lean in fully on God. Now, I don't ever want to seek out suffering. I don't want you to experience suffering. but good can come out of our suffering. The key is, how do we respond to our suffering? Do we turn away from God and put our whole focus on what's going on in our lives? Maybe blame God for what's going on in our lives? Do we whine and complain like we're going to see the Israelites do throughout Exodus? Do we feel sorry for ourselves and kind of throw ourselves a pity party? Do we get crabby and lash out to our loved ones around us? Or do we lean into God, trusting that He is sovereign and He's at work, even in the midst of our suffering? That verse I shared a minute ago, John 16:33, that Jesus said to expect suffering, but He said, take heart because I have overcome the world. We need to put our eyes on Jesus, not our problems. And that reorients our thinking. Okay, so now we know that Pharaoh has tried suppressing the Israelites by harsh labor to stop them from growing and try to keep them under control. But verse 12 says, the more that they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. So clearly, Pharaoh's plan is not working. And clearly we can see that even in their suffering, God is at work for the Israelites and in their lives. Hear me say this, ladies, that is true for whatever you are facing today. No matter what you are struggling with, God is at work in you, in your situation, in your life and around you. And that is something that we can stand on. All right, so this didn't work. Plan A didn't work for Pharaoh, so he moves on to plan B. And this is where we learn about the courageous women, the midwives. Verses 15 through 18, starting with 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah. Okay, we're going to hit pause a second real quick. So first of all, we want to notice that the king is not named in this passage. We don't ever learn his name. Pharaoh is like the same thing as like a king. It's a title. And so we don't know the king's name, but we do know the names of the two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, right? And so that's significant because these women are significant. They are courageous. Now, it's believed that there had to be many midwives, because think of just how big the Israelite nation was, not to even mention the Egyptian nation. And so it's believed that these two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, are actually overseers of the midwives, which is why they're called to go in front of Pharaoh when he wants to meet with them. All right, so verse 16. Pharaoh's telling the midwives, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. Now, most commentaries say that this was kind of a sneaky way for Pharaoh to kill the baby boys, because many, many births resulted in the death of the infant. And so it was kind of like they could kill the baby boys and the parents wouldn't even really know if the baby had died just in birth or if it had been murdered. And so that's kind of what the belief is that it was a sneaky way of going about it. The other thing we want to take note here is that Pharaoh said, but if it's a girl, let her live, because Pharaoh felt no threat from the females. He only felt threatened by the males. Now, I want you to put that in your pocket and hold it for next week, because we're going to circle back to that next week and talk about that a little bit. Verse 17. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered the Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. Now we're gonna pay attention to a couple things in here. One is that the midwives feared God, not man. They chose to serve God, not what Pharaoh had commanded them to do. Now, we read this and it's just, a sentence later. But in order for the Pharaoh to realize that they had not been killing the baby boys, much time had to have passed so that he noticed that baby boys were around and that they had not been killed. So that means the midwives didn't just have to choose 1 day, 2 days, 5 days to disobey Pharaoh, knowing that he had the power to kill them for their disobedience. They had to choose day after day after day that they were going to serve God and not man. That is a big deal. And we need to notice that this is actually over at least months, if not longer, that these midwives had to make this decision over and over again. Now we look at this and it's, I look at this and I say, they lied. In the Ten Commandments, it says, do not lie. That's a very clear command. And so was it wrong for them to lie? The answer to that is actually found in the text to come, but we are going to talk about that just a little bit before we get to that. We need to obey authority. The Bible tells us that, except when it goes against the commands of God. Our first allegiance is to God, our Creator. And so when authority is giving us instruction that goes against what God's commands are, then we need to choose to follow God, not man. There are some examples in the Bible where people lied. And I have a couple that I'm going to share with you about women who lied. Rahab lies. You can read about her in Joshua 2. She lies and hides the spies, the Israelite spies, and then sets them free. And so I would love for you to go and read that in Joshua 2. You can also read about another place where Jael lies in Judges chapter 4 and 5. It tells a story of where Deborah prophesies about a kingdom falling and a king being killed. And it ends up being that this king kind of falls into Jael's area, and she invites him into her tent, and she says she'll get him some milk, but she actually stabs him with a tent stake and kills him. So she lies to get him into the tent and get him to relax, and then she kills him. So we see when the command or the thing that is being expected of us goes against God's command, we need to follow God, not man. Some modern day examples would be in World War II, the Christians who hid Jews to save their lives. We see it in underground churches now in communist countries. They need to follow God before they follow man. All right, so now we do want to remember that Pharaoh seemed to have all the power here. He's the one who had the authority to kill the midwives for disobeying. So this act of obedience to God over Pharaoh, it was no small thing, and we need to take notice of that. And now we want to see what God's response to Shiphrah and Puah was after they were obedient to him and then actually lied to the Pharaoh. Verse 20. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So midwives did not have families because they had to actually go out at odd hours, all night long. They would get called out for a birth. And so they didn't have families. They didn't have children of their own because their job was to take care of these births. Commentaries say that it was probably a position that was chosen for them. And so they were put into this role as a midwife, not necessarily choosing to be a midwife and not ever have a family of their own. So God didn't punish them for what they did. He actually rewarded them, and he gave them families of their own. Now, we don't always get rewarded for following God and his way. We don't always receive some amazing blessing when we choose to be obedient to God. Because you see, we don't follow God's command so that we'll get blessed. We follow God's command because he is the God of the universe. He is our creator. And we need to follow him out of obedience to him, not so that we can receive something in return. Another thing to notice about the midwives is, remember, the Israelites have been living near Egypt or right outside of Egypt for around 400 years. And so they've been exposed to the gods, the small g gods in Egypt, and yet they worshiped God. They knew that he was God the creator and that he was almighty and he was to be worshiped. And so they feared God over man here. And so that's another important thing to notice, that even after all these years, these midwives still feared God and worshiped him. All right, so now Pharaoh tried to stop the Israelites from growing by making them slaves and oppressing them. He then told the midwives to kill all the boys at birth. That still didn't work. So now Pharaoh's moving on to his plan C. In verse 22, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but every girl let live. So Pharaoh's taking things into his own hands here now, and he is putting out a command across the board that if somebody sees a baby boy, they are to throw him into the Nile to kill him. Now, the Nile was a river running through Egypt. It was their source of life. They absolutely needed the Nile to live. They worshiped that because it was a source of life for them. But now do we notice that the source of life becomes the source of death? These babies are going to be thrown into the Nile and drowned. Now, this killing of these baby boys should sound a little bit familiar for those of us who are familiar with the New Testament, because in Matthew 2, when Jesus was born, we hear about another king, King Herod, who heard that a king was being born to the Israelites. And because he feared any power that they might have, he ordered that all of the Hebrew boys 2 and under be killed. So we see how this story of this command that was given in Exodus 1 verse 22 points to our Messiah. And we see similarities of all the boys being killed, the Jewish boys being killed, when Jesus was born. Now, this is also interesting that when King Herod ordered all of the baby boys 2 and under to be killed in Jesus' day, that an angel appeared to Joseph and told Joseph to take Mary and the baby and flee. And where did they go? But to Egypt. So now we have our Israelites escaping out of Egypt after all these babies have been killed. And in Matthew 2, we hear about Jesus being saved, going into Egypt, and that was his safe place. When we break down chapter 1, we see that despite being in Egypt, which we read about in verses 1 through 7, and despite being oppressed, which we read about in verses 8 through 14, and despite being threatened, which we read about in verses 15 through 22, God's people prosper because of God's promise. It is God at work. No man can destroy them because God is at work. So through those times of struggle, God's people could return to this story and find hope. They could find confidence that God would be at work and keep his promises. And we get to see that too. We get to see God's faithfulness in the story, and we get to look for that faithfulness in whatever it is that we're facing now. We get to remember his faithfulness then and remember that he will be faithful today. We see in the story that we need to fear God more than we fear man. We need to put our eyes on God no matter what our circumstances are. When we have our eyes on our circumstances, we lose hope. When we have our eyes on God, we actually get filled up, and we put our eyes on the one who is absolutely sovereign and in control. Moses wrote this story down so that the people of God would remember God's faithfulness. Do you believe that God is faithful? In your suffering, in the difficult days, do you live like you believe God's faithfulness? Do we put our eyes on God instead of focusing on our suffering? When we read Genesis and Exodus, we see hardship, we see suffering, but through it all, we see God's faithfulness. We can trust God to be faithful with whatever we are facing today. When we started our lesson, I asked you to write down something that you are dealing with that is difficult, some type of suffering, whether it's now or in the recent past. Right now, I'm going to ask you to write down a time when you have seen God's faithfulness at work. And tell that story to someone. Tell the story of God's faithfulness. We need to remember his faithfulness in times of trouble. Tell the story and remember. God bless you.